Good morning, everybody. It's a great pleasure and an honor for me to introduce to you Dr. Taylor Wayne Acee. Dr. Taylor is Associate Professor of the Department of Curriculum and Instruction of the Texas State University. His conference today is entitled Strategic and Self-Regulated Learning, Implications for Education Context. You are very welcome, Professor Taylor. I thank you in advance for how much knowledge we'll be sharing with us today.
Thank you so much, Dr. Boruchovitch. It's been a pleasure working with you, and I'm honored to be here today. I'm just going to take a moment to share my PowerPoint slide with you. Hola, meu nome é Taylor Acee. It is a pleasure and honor to be here with you today. First, I would like to thank my dear friend and colleague, Dr. Boruchovitch, and all those who have helped her for arranging this symposium virtually during this worldwide pandemic. As we distance ourselves from one another, it is ever more vital that we stay connected. And as teaching and learning continue to move online, the need to help students become more strategic and self-regulated will be ever more important. My talk today is entitled Strategic and Self-Regulated Learning, Implications for Educational Context. And a major goal of this talk is to present a conceptual framework called the Model of Strategic Learning. This will help lay a foundation for exploring practical approaches to fostering strategic and self-regulated learning in diverse educational contexts. And as Lewin said, there is nothing as practical as a good theory. But to begin, I will tell you a little bit about myself and my program of research. So as Dr. Boruchovitch said, I am an associate professor at Texas State University. And my research focuses on assessing strategic learning, self-regulation, motivation, and a lot of my empirical work is focused on motivational interventions, particularly those related to helping students find personal relevance in what they're learning. I'm also an author of the Learning and Study Strategies Inventory, who I got involved with that with my mentor, Dr. Weinstein, who developed that assessment. And we have a number of educational interventions that are delivered online to help students to improve in the areas that the LASSE assesses. And so part of my research it's really focused on factors that contribute to and detract from post-secondary student learning and achievement. And I've also done some work in K through 12, but all the concepts that we'll be talking about today can really be applied in primary, secondary, and post-secondary educational contexts. I'm interested in variables that are causative in nature. So if we could change an aspect of a student, we'd expect a resulting cause and effect on their academic outcomes, such as their learning and their grade point average. I'm also interested in factors that are amenable to change through educational intervention. So there's a number of things that can affect learning, personality differences, the socioeconomic status and things like this. But I'm particularly tend to focus on those that we can actually do something about through an educational intervention. So those are kind of the things that we'll target. And the last criteria for these variables are that they account for a meaningful amount of variation in academic outcomes. This is Claire Ellen Weinstein. She developed the model that I'm going to be talking about today. It's called the Model of Strategic Learning. And that's my mentor. And she passed away in 2016. And her and I and Evelyn have done a lot of work together. And here are two of the citations for the Model of Strategic Learning. And I'm just going to go through this model a little bit today. I realize there's a lot of text in there. The main areas that I'll be talking about is skill, will, and self-regulation. And what this model does is it helps to organize factors that affect students' success in education. And it organizes them under skill, will, and self-regulation. And these are, we try to differentiate between what students have direct control over and what is outside of their control but might be important to learn about. And so everything listed under skill, will, and self-regulation, the student can learn about and improve in that area, and that should have a resulting effect on their success in learning and grade point average and things like this, persistence. So skill is knowing what to do and how to do it. So, for example, my little cousin, when I got a new car, he's not able to drive, at least at the time when I got my new car. He was only 15 years old, but he wanted to drive my car. And he tried to make a case for it. He said, I know what to do. I know that the gas pedal makes it go, the steering wheel makes it turn, the brake makes it stop. How hard can it be? I know what to do. Well, I'm not going to let him take up my car because he doesn't know how to drive. He might know what to do. He doesn't know how to do it. And so the same is true with learning. Students can know about a variety of different note-taking strategies and learning strategies and motivational strategies, but that doesn't mean they know how to use them. So whenever we're trying to help students to improve their skill, we're focusing on what I would call declarative and procedural knowledge. Declarative knowledge is the knowing what to do. The procedural knowledge is knowing how to do it. So there's a lot of things listed under the skill component that we could help our students to improve in. We could help them know more about themselves as a learner, to help them learn more about the nature of the academic tasks that they're facing. And a big part of this is knowing about different learning strategies and skills. Now, on the other side is skill in, and this has to do with practicing and developing kind of the how-to knowledge of using different learning strategies, reading and listening comprehension strategies, note-taking and note-using, preparing for and taking tests, and things like this. But is knowing what to do and how to do it enough to succeed in primary, secondary, and post-secondary education? The answer is no, it's not enough. You also have to want to succeed. So the will component deals with motivational type issues. I read a statistic recently that said only 50% of people floss. And you wonder, you know, dentists say you should floss daily, but only 50% of people floss daily. Why is that? It's not because they don't know what to do and how to do it. Sometimes you just don't feel like flossing. You don't want to do it. And the same is true with learning. Students sometimes don't want to put in the effort and motivation. So some of the big indexes of motivation are students' choices, their choice to pursue a particular career or a major, or their choice to enroll in science classes or choosing different types of courses. So their choices is an indication of their motivation. Their effort, the level of intensity that they engage in a learning activity, as well as their persistence, persisting in the face of difficulty and in the face of low interest. But what underlies these behaviors are psychological factors. And so under the will component, we target a lot of the psychological things such as students' values, their beliefs, their goals, and emotions. These are factors that influence our choice, effort, and persistence. So as educators, we can influence students' motivation by trying to help them with their beliefs. For example, many students in mathematics contexts know they can't do math. They say, I'm not a math person. Well, in this case, the intelligent thing to do is to not try in math if you know you can't do it. If I asked you to walk up the side of a wall, would you try? No, because you know you can't. The same thing's true with students who have this belief about mathematics. They're not going to try if they know they can't do it. So to motivate students, we now need to look at how do we help them to adopt self-efficacy and confidence and a belief that they can succeed. That's what's standing in our way of helping them learn. So there's a number of things listed under here: helping students to cultivate a future time perspective, helping them set challenging yet realistic goals that are specific and measurable, helping to generate emotions that move them towards learning and don't push them away from it, and things like this. But is knowing what to do and how to do it and wanting to do it enough to succeed? And the answer there is no, too. Self-regulation is a major component of what helps students succeed. You can want to do well in school, and you can have the skills to do it, but self-regulation is the active, ongoing management of your thoughts, feelings, and behaviors in pursuit of goals. So, as things change, we have to be adaptive. We have to assess where we're at constantly and continue to regulate ourselves towards our goals. And so many of the things that fall under this component of the model of strategic learning are things like time managing. And this can happen on real-time levels and over larger portions of time. You could, for example, work on managing your time for a specific learning activity that might only take an hour, but you could also work on managing your time for the entire semester. So time management is a very self-regulatory activity. Concentration is another one. Comprehension monitoring whether or not you're understanding what you're reading, for example, and being proactive and intentional about checking your comprehension as you read and ensuring you've learned what you set out to learn. And we'll talk a little bit more about some examples under each of these three components later in the talk. Now, learning does not occur in a vacuum. So the outside of the model of strategic learning focuses on aspects of the academic environment that are important to develop knowledge about so that you can be more strategic. But these are factors that are not under students' direct control. Things like requirements of the learning activity, assignment, or test. It's important to develop knowledge about those things. It's critical if you want to do well, but you can't really change those things. The teacher sets that. Teachers' beliefs and expectations, available resources, learning centers, tutoring, study halls, things like this, instructors going to their office hours or meeting with them after class. And then the last one is social context and support. So whenever, I used to teach a Learning to Learn course, and I coordinated one for college students, and we used the model of strategic learning and taught students in-depth information about all of these areas and tried to help them to improve. Now, you don't have to, if you want to teach strategic learning, you don't have to do it in a 3-credit college course. You can do little things here and there throughout the day to prompt students to think about their skill, will, self-regulation in the academic environment. And just those little prompts, it could be, a few minutes here, a few minutes there, a little extra question on an activity or an assignment that can make a real big difference in students' lives and to help them improve in these areas. So I've been talking about strategic learning, but we haven't discussed what the characteristics of a strategic learner are yet. And here are some of the characteristics according to the work that I've done with Claire Ellen and the model of strategic learning. Students are goal-directed. Strategic learners use effective and efficient learning strategies. And that takes a while to figure out what's effective and efficient for you. What's true for one person might not be true for another. So there's a very intense part of kind of individualizing and figuring out what works for you that students have to go through. It's not something you can just hand them. It's something they have to figure out that for themselves, but we guide them in doing that. Another characteristic of strategic learning is that students monitor and evaluate learning goals and processes. A lot of students come in and they really don't have a clear idea of what they're setting out to accomplish. So setting goals is a big part of this, but then having them monitor and evaluate them. Students who are strategic learn from their mistakes and their successes. That is information. Whenever you make a mistake or you have a success, that is information that feeds back into you in figuring out what's effective and efficient for you. And then the last one is being an active manager of the learning process. So some of the conceptions underlying the model of strategic learning, again, it really helps to organize factors that affect student success and targets those that are causative in nature and that research has shown to be causative in nature, are amenable to change through educational intervention, and can account for a meaningful amount of variation in student success. The MSL suggests that all students can improve their learning and achievement. It's not just some students, all students have the potential to improve and develop. And students are not bound by intelligence, prior achievement, and background characteristics. Students can rise above barriers, and that we can help them do that. They're not fixed and stuck in a situation. We can bring them out of that. And the last one is that strategic learning emerges from interactions among elements within skill, will, and self-regulation. So it's not any one thing or one factor or one component that is the be-all, end-all explanatory reason why students succeed. It's not just skill or just will. It's how they work together. It's like a gestalt. The whole is bigger than the sum of its parts. So it assumes that success in strategic learning emerges from interactions among these elements. And I think that the model is empowering to students when they hear about this model and you teach aspects of it, because it shows that they can improve from where they're at today. And that's a big message to sell this for students, that, focusing on things will help you reach your goals. And that's a big approach, I think, in helping explain why this kind of content is important to teach. Students will be more likely to buy in and be motivated to learn about learning strategies and self-regulation when they understand how it can help them. And it's going to help them be more effective and efficient with reaching their goals. So I love this ancient proverb, give a person a fish, you feed him for a day. Teach a person to fish, you feed her for a lifetime. And this is the idea that we're trying to get across when we're talking about teaching strategic and self-regulated learning. We want to teach students to fish. We want to teach students so that they can self-regulate their own learning. And we can just kind of guide them through that. So how do you foster strategic and self-regulated learning? Well, there's not any one answer, and there's not any one approach. There's tons of things that you can do, and people have been doing them for years. Before we even had a theory to tell us what all this was, people were doing this. And so, handouts are a simple thing that some folks do. Learning centers sometimes have handouts for students to take that will teach them different note-taking methods and things like this. Workshops, which could be online or face-to-face. These are some of the, quicker things. It might not be as useful for students who are really struggling because there's not as much support and scaffolding in a handout or a one-shot workshop. Assessments, learning strategies assessments help to provide students with feedback about where they're strong and what areas they can improve in related to their learning strategies. And I'll talk about these later in the talk. Online programs, like I said, we have developed online modules that teach students these concepts and how to apply them to their own lives. Study is another one that Phil Winnie to Simon Fraser has developed. Advising and advisor training. So advisors can play a major role in helping students develop in their skill, will, and self-regulation. And if you want your advisors to do that, you'll probably have to have some training that teaches advisors about self-regulation and how to incorporate that within an advising session, which could be a one-on-one or group advising session. Tutoring and tutor training. We have a lot of supplemental instruction, which is a form of group tutoring that we do in college a lot. And our SI leaders, our supplemental instruction leaders, they are trained to teach students about how to use learning strategies. Now they're targeting a specific course, maybe a science course or a history course, you know, big, large lecture course where students tend to struggle is where we have supplemental instruction. But all of our SI leaders are trained to teach strategic and self-regulated learning. And they do it, and they get results from that. Learning centers are a great resource for students and can be a source through which you teach self-regulation. But the two I'm going to talk about today are strategic learning courses, also referred to as learning to learn courses, and then teaching with a meta-curriculum. And so teaching with a meta-curriculum, no matter what course you're teaching, science, reading, math, history, etc., you have your curriculum. That's your course content. It's your science content or your reading content or your history content. But then there's your meta-curriculum. And this is what you set out to teach students so that they can become more strategic and self-regulated within that course. So to teach with a meta-curriculum, you know, you probably want to think about what can I do to help students improve their skill, will, self-regulation, and be more aware of important factors within the academic environment. Those are some things that, you know, I use the model strategic learning as a way to choose what curriculum. I use the model of strategic learning in my research, I use it in my teaching, and I use it as a basis to determine what my meta-curriculum will be. Now, if, you know, I'm teaching a statistics course, which I also do teach statistics, you know, I'm not going to teach everything in the model of strategic learning. I'll go through and highlight some of the key factors that I think will be important to teach alongside my statistics content. So I have my statistics curriculum, and then I have my meta-curriculum. And my meta-curriculum is for teaching self-regulated learning. And it doesn't need to eat up a lot of class time. I have so many instructors saying, I don't have time to teach. I barely have enough time to teach math. How am I supposed to teach a meta-curriculum too? No, it doesn't need to take up a lot of time. And in fact, you're probably already doing stuff where you're teaching skill, will, and self-regulation. And what would just change would be that you do more to explicitly discuss strategies related to skill, will, and self-regulation. Have students practice using those strategies, and then set aside some time where they can reflect on their successes and how to improve in your course. You probably do some of this after you give a test and you have students reflect and things like this. You can do that same thing and then make it more explicit that this is a strategy, this reflection after a test and thinking about what you did well and what you didn't do well and how you can improve next time. That's a strategy that you can use here and in other places to be a more successful learner, helping them to realize that, you know, that these are things that you can do to be more successful, not just in my course, but in other courses. So when we're teaching learning strategies, there are three types of knowledge that we want to help students to develop. And kind of the most basic type of knowledge is declarative knowledge. And this is knowing about different learning strategies. And this could be learning strategies related to skill. It could be learning strategies related to will, which you might also call motivational regulation strategies. But we're using the term learning strategy here very broadly to refer to any strategy that can improve your chances of success of learning. And that could be targeting skill, will, or self-regulation. Procedural knowledge is knowing how to effectively and efficiently use those strategies. And conditional is knowing the conditions under which particular learning strategies are more or less effective and efficient. So for example, in one case, in a history class or something, maybe you find it really useful to make a graphic organizer, a timeline of historical events. And so that's a really effective and efficient strategy for this particular history course that you're working in. And that might not be a good strategy for a math course that you're working in. So knowing the conditions under which different strategies are more or less effective is the most kind of sophisticated type of knowledge that we can help our students to develop, and that's through having them apply it. And with teaching learning strategies, there are four kind of things we want to think about doing. One is direct instruction, and that involves telling them what the strategy is and why it can be helpful. So, you don't want to just say, do this because I said so. You want to give the reasoning, some of the theoretical backing for why this strategy could be useful. Modeling is demonstrating how to use the strategy. So, for example, a learning strategy would be summarizing the information in your own words. That's one of the simplest, I think, cognitive learning strategies, and it's really effective. Try to, don't just repeat it word for word. Try to summarize what you just read in your own words. So, you can explain, direct instruction will be explaining what that strategy is and why it can be useful. And then modeling it. So, as a teacher, giving a summary of something you just taught, and then having students practice summarizing as a strategy. You can provide advice and support as students practice, and then gradually remove that support. And that's the idea of scaffolding, so that they can eventually do it on their own. And then provide feedback on strategy development over time as they apply it to different learning tasks or situations. And then collaborative learning is a great way to teach learning strategies because students can give each other feedback on their strategy development. So let's talk a little bit about some things that we can incorporate into a meta-curriculum that fall under the skill component. Now, of course, there are plenty of things you could address under skill, but two things that I think tend to be pretty important are teaching elaboration and organizational strategies. Students often over-rely on rote repetition and memorization. It has its place in learning. I mean, repeating something, memorizing it, it can be useful, but it only goes so far. To really understand something, make it your own, and develop a more complex, sophisticated knowledge structure, we're going to have to move into using elaboration and organizational strategies. And this will save students time in the long run. Rereading a text it's not an efficient strategy. I mean, if you reread a text 20 times, you might get some good stuff from it, but that's not efficient. So these actually save time in the long run, and they make learning more meaningful. So some examples of elaboration strategies are summarizing or paraphrasing things in your own words, applying knowledge. So you learn something and then you try to apply it to another task or another setting. Perspective taking, in historical context, you could take the perspective of different, factions that are warring with each other and try to take on both viewpoints to understand the different issues they face. Generating and answering possible test questions. Visualizing and imagining, to understand seasonal changes across the globe. You could imagine, where the sun is in relationship to the earth and how it orbits. Visualizing can get pretty complicated, but it can also be simple things like using visualization just to increase your memory for something. And then teaching the material to someone else. As instructors, you know that when you teach something, it helps you learn it. So that's a great strategy that I like to use in my classes. So not just having students use these strategies, but explaining that they are strategies and that they can help them learn. Making that explicit. And then organizational strategies like creating outlines, flow charts, concept maps, and creating matrices. These are all things that students can use to study for tests and that you can do in class and help them improve their strategies. Will. Again, there's a lot of things we could talk about under the will component, but some of them are attributional feedback. So, you know, if students are thinking that what affects their success is outside of their control, then why would they try? So if you believe that, you know, your success in school is totally outside of your control, it just has to do with your innate intelligence and how good your teacher is, then there's no reason to put in motivation. So when we talk about attributions, we want to emphasize factors that are under students' control, such as their strategy use and effort. And don't emphasize uncontrollable factors like intelligence and things like that. One activity I love to do with students is after a test or a major assignment, I ask them, list all the things that affected your success or failure on this assignment or test. And they list everything. And then I have them categorize those things as controllable or uncontrollable, and then use that as a springboard for discussion. And then the last one, which is near and dear to my heart because I do a lot of empirical research on this, is personal relevance. And what research is showing is that simply asking students to reflect about how what they are learning could be useful, meaningful, or personally relevant can really help students to improve their learning and motivation. So this is a simple prompt that you can ask students to do. I teach doctoral courses in statistics and motivation and things like this. I have my doctoral students answer this question. You know, how is what you're learning in the statistics course going to be useful, meaningful, or relevant to you? And then I'll ask them to do the same thing with specific, you know, concepts from the course, as well as just in the course in general or the subject in general. And the last one is under self-regulation and using a systematic approach to learning. Here's where everything kind of comes together, skill and will. And getting students to think about what they do before, during, and after a learning task or a learning goal. If you can get them to think about before, during, and after and plan for what they're going to do and actually do that, that would be a big step forward for students. Before learning tasks, you know, we can guide students. You could even set up an activity where, you know, here's a learning task, but before you start, consider your motivations for this task. You know, do you feel confident that you can do it? How could it be useful for you? Now set some learning goals for what you want to accomplish with this task and break those learning goals down into little bits and pieces. And strategically plan how you're going to accomplish those goals by choosing learning strategies that you think will help you to learn the material. This is something, if students set aside a little time to do this, they'll be a lot more effective. And we can help scaffold them to make that a habit. And then during, students should be monitoring and evaluating their goal progress and making changes to the strategies they're using or the goals they're setting along the way. And then after the task is over, have them evaluate their goal attainment. Consider influences, you know, what affected, you know, how well you reached this goal. And then target, again, controllable factors, things like strategies and effort. So getting students to use this systematic approach and, you know, being very intentional and proactive by thinking about what they do before, during, and after a learning task can be a very effective strategy for students. So I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about academic help seeking, which I also see as a highly self-regulatory activity. But I think it's important to talk about a little bit about this because, you know, for students to improve, they're going to need help from others. And it's important to point out 3 types of help seeking. One is avoidance. And here's where students avoid seeking help, and for a variety of different reasons. Expedient help seeking is where they do seek help, but they're focused on obtaining the correct answer rather than learning. Have you seen folks like this? You're probably familiar with students who use expedient help seeking. And then instrumental help seeking. Here's where we're focused on learning the material, and you want to be able to do it on their own. And so we want to try to help students move into instrumental help seeking. And we can do this by explicitly talking about help seeking and then trying to build community and use words of encouragement that help students to feel comfortable seeking help from you as the instructor. And seeking help, the building community part can also help with seeking help from one another, students seeking help from students. So, you know, something to think about as you try to help your students to become more active instrumental help seekers. So that was all kind of under teaching with a meta curriculum in a content course. Now I want to talk just a little bit about strategic learning courses. And this is near and dear to my heart because I used to teach and coordinate a strategic learning course, and I really believe in them. And currently we're doing a big investigation in Texas. Since 2001, the state of Texas has allowed colleges to offer strategic learning courses, and they count in our formula funding, meaning, like, you know, because we have a public institution, we get money for every head that's in the class. And so the state recognizes this as a legitimate course. Why? Because we are teaching learning theory, and that is the subject. But it's also, the other goal is to apply that learning theory to students' own studying. So it also helps them to improve as a student. It's kind of the best of both worlds. You're teaching content that's important, psychological content. It's like a psychology course. But we're also having students apply the psychology of learning to their own studying behaviors. So if it's possible, if you can, if you want to, create a course at your institution, or if you have a study hall, instead of just letting students do whatever they want, teach them a little bit about strategic learning. We have it, our course, count towards credit, it counts towards their degree, and it qualifies for state funding. So I think that is, you know, if you can, shoot for something like that. And so I'll talk about there are three major aspects to designing an effective learning frameworks course. Also, strategic learning course, we call it learning frameworks in Texas. Developing a theory-based curriculum, using pre and post assessments, and teaching learning strategies for transferability. So you want to be able to teach learning strategies that can transfer to a science class, to a history class, and have students apply those learning strategies to all their courses that they're in. And so we already talked about teaching with a meta curriculum, which is very much the same as teaching learning strategies for transferability. So I won't talk about that. I'm just going to talk about developing a theory-based curriculum and using pre and post assessments. So developing a theory-based curriculum, first you have to really consider the purpose of your course and ensure it is aligned with that purpose. So, you know, the learning to learn course I had, it was just general. It was for all students, anyone who wanted to take it, but particularly for those who were on academic probation. But you might want to develop a learning frameworks course for that has a STEM focus, or that's focused on a little bit on career development or something like this. So you have to consider what the purpose is for your students and what their needs are to determine what the curriculum is. But I would suggest that you at least try to address some aspects related to skill, will, self-regulation, and the academic environment, and that you teach students theories of learning and motivation. So, you know, carefully review textbooks and other reading materials that you're going to use in the course to ensure that they're theory and research-based. There's a lot of stuff out there that's just, you know, it doesn't explain why the strategies work. It doesn't give students a framework for understanding how learning works. And that's so important. research on transfer, being able to transfer what you learn into a different situation shows that having a conceptual framework for understanding how learning works is really important so that you can transfer it to new situations. And so if you're just teaching isolated note-taking skills without explaining why those note-taking skills work, it's probably not going to be as effective. So really explaining the why is important. Learning strategies assessments can be very useful in courses like this as well, because it can provide feedback on students' strengths and areas for improvement related to strategic learning. It can also help to individualize instruction. For example, you could have students work on one of the areas that they're lower in to help them improve in those areas. And it could also help to inform class instruction. For example, you might want to increase instruction in an area that's low across the entire class. Time management is always a big one for the classes that I taught. So, we'd do our assessments and we'd see, oh, everyone's really reporting struggling with time management and procrastination. So let's address this with a little more emphasis. And then pre-test, post-test scores can also be very useful. It provides students with feedback on how they improved across the semester. We always use it as a basis for projects and papers. We'd have students report their scores. We'd have them make graphs of their scores so they get to learn a little bit about graphing. And then they would have to explain if their score went up, stayed the same, or went down. They would write a paper that explained what they did that may have affected that. So it really got a very self-reflective type of paper where we incorporated their pre-post-test scores. And it also can help instructors assess individual student growth and overall course success. It can be used as an outcome to evaluate the course. Some sample learning strategies assessments. Well, the Learning and Study Strategies Inventory is one, and that's one I'm an author on with my mentor who had passed away. And Dr. Acee Boruchovitch and I have been doing work with the Acee in Brazil, and she and her team have translated the Acee third edition into Brazilian Portuguese. And we're currently still, I believe, have some more data to collect related to that. We have 3 articles out now using the data from the Acee. So there's also some other learning strategies assessments that are widely used. The Motivated Strategies for Learning questionnaire. I believe Evely has also translated a few of the scales on that. And then some that kind of emerged more out of the European tradition that I have listed here as well. And they're all worth looking at and considering if you are looking for a learning strategies assessment. But I'm not sure if the last 2 have been translated to Brazilian Portuguese or not. But I know for sure the Acee has. So now I'd like to open it up to discussion. Really feel free to share any questions or comments you have. I did put a couple other questions in here to just prompt some things you might want to think about, but you don't have to answer these questions. But one of them is, how do you incorporate strategic learning in your programs and courses? And what ideas do you have for the future with regards to incorporating strategic learning?
So, Taylor, I would like to thank you so much. Your presentation is just wonderful. I have a lots of very comments about it, very positive comments about it. And thank you so much for sharing so much knowledge with us this morning. And I have a set of questions which I will try to translate to you, so that you can answer. We have a couple of minutes, and we should do that. Okay?
That sounds great. Thank you. I will look in the chat for something in English.
that you won't find that, unfortunately. Are you hear me? Are you hear me well?
Oh, you're gonna, yeah. So you're gonna repeat the questions in English?
Yes, I will translate them. I will translate them, And there is one reflection, just a reflection, a comment that we have like our secondary education is very tired, and it's very hard to put some new stuff into it. It's very tired, the program, but it's just a comment. Another question is that if you could talk a little bit, there are two questions about that. If you could talk a little bit about how can we teach students to do some self-evaluation, and if you believe there is a more effective self-evaluation strategies, you can talk about their effectiveness. And another question that I will put together with this one is it possible, do you believe it's possible to teach self-evaluation strategies in kindergarten?
Yeah, great questions. I think the first one had to do with, not having a lot of time to address these kinds of issues in class and secondary education. One thing that I use all the time in my courses, whether it's an undergraduate course or a workshop with middle school students or a doctoral course, is the 1 to 5 minute paper. And you can do that in class. You can have students take out a piece of paper and a pencil or pen and ask them to, give them some type of prompt that would address their learning strategies or their motivation. Give them some kind of prompt like that and say, just write for 1 minute or write for 3 minutes, no more than 5 minutes. And that's something very quick and easy that you can do to get students to plan, to get them to self-evaluate and self-reflect. And it doesn't take much time. Prompting students to think about what they intend to do and what their goals are, or prompting them to evaluate their goals, it can be a big change for students. They might not be doing that on their own. And when you start to ask them to do that, just with like a 1 minute paper at the end of class or at the beginning of class, it can start to form those habits, and they can benefit just from that single experience. There's been, Dale Schunk has done a lot of research with in elementary context with teaching goal setting, and different self-regulatory strategies. And so I think you can teach some self-regulation even in kindergarten, but it wouldn't be it would be, you'd really have to scaffold them through that. You'd be, doing it in the moment. It wouldn't be something you'd probably give them and have them take home and do on their own. They're not regulated enough to do that. But you could start to form some of these habits. I mean, kindergarten students can certainly formulate goals, and they can certainly evaluate whether they did something or didn't do something and how well they think they did. And so we can prompt them to think about these things. Now, whether they're going to go and do that on their own afterwards, that might take more time to develop, but I think planting the seeds early is important. And so anything specifically related to a lot of questions about self-evaluation, I think that it is important there's kind of two types of self-evaluation that we teach in our Learning to Learn course. And one is called formative evaluation, and the other is called summative evaluation. And we try to engage students in both. Formative evaluation occurs during the task. So it's the idea of monitoring and evaluating while you're implementing a task. And this could be, during a class activity, or it could be on a paper that you're working on over several weeks. So, it depends on the time scale of the task itself. But regardless, formative evaluation would be during the task, before it's over, before the end result has occurred. Summative evaluation occurs after the task. So after you get your grade back, for example, or after you finish writing your paper. And both of those are important. Formative evaluation can obviously help you course correct during the task. Summative evaluation can help you, really kind of take a comprehensive look at what you've done, and that would inform, how you would proceed on a future task. So I think that's one way to think about evaluation that could be helpful is, thinking about how you can prompt students to formatively and summatively evaluate their learning success. You need to unmute.
Yeah, I will ask another question. There are a lot of questions, so I'm trying to do my best to select and put together some of them. And we have one question here asking you about here in Brazil. I don't know if it happens in the US as well, but here in Brazil we have a lot of like a passive students and teachers that are oriented towards transmitting knowledge rather than promoting an active role of the students. And there is a question about that. The person comments about that and asks how you can develop self-regulation if you have like such a scenario. This is one question. And another question that I will ask also to you together is that someone asked, do you believe that meta curriculum is the same of infusion curriculum?
Okay. Well, so for the first question, in the U.S., we have a lot of instructors who, especially in college context, but even in, when you look in high school and things like this, where they view their class as the purpose of it is to sift out the poor students from the good students. Their goal is to identify the good students and move them along and weed out the bad students. This attitude is not going to help everyone improve. It might help the students who happen to be performing well get better, but it is not going to help the students who are struggling get better. And if our goal as educators is to help individuals grow and improve, we really have to think about students holistically. And like I was saying before, many times, in order to help a student learn, it doesn't have to do with teaching them the right material. It has to do with addressing their concerns, their beliefs, their values, things like this that are detracting from their motivation or detracting from their learning. And as educators, we can do stuff like that in the classroom, and we can do it in ways that don't need to eat up a lot of time. Now, you're not going to get to every student. I mean, there's no way. Some students will not. You can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. That's true. But there are some things you can do to make it more likely that it drinks. And so I think that's kind of the attitude maybe we need to have. In the US, I mean, we have public education systems, and the goal is to educate every student. It's not to find the good ones and move them up. So I think maybe that helps to address some of that question. What was the other question?
And the other question was about whether do you believe you talked about teaching self-regulated learning through meta curriculum. Do you believe it's the same of curriculum infusion? It's the same term, or there are different concepts? What's your opinion about that?
Yeah, I think it is very similar.
Yeah.
I do. I don't know if the infusion approach, does it also address like motivation and things like this, or is it more focused on like higher order thinking skills? I'm not sure. But when I talk about the meta curriculum, I'm not just talking about using higher level thinking skills, but I'm also talking about how to help students with time management, with procrastination, with motivation, concentration issues, you know, and helping them to use the resources available to them in their academic environment, and helping them become more active help seekers. So I think they're probably very similar.
I think
but just to clarify, the meta curriculum is definitely like addressing all the things under the model of strategic learning, not just like the cognitive things.
And I think just a comment. I think infusion curriculum addresses all this, all the components involved in the learning, not only the cognitive or the higher executive ones. I believe this question is very well answered. Let me see. We have a lot of questions. There is a question. It's well known that a self-regulated teacher is able to teach better self-regulation to your student. How do you believe can we create a meta curriculum to teach self-regulation in higher education? And I cannot forget, just before everybody's saying excellent, excellent. You are receiving a lot of positive comments. Thank you, and saying that it was a bright explanation, a bright conference. So I have to thank you for that also.
Oh yeah, and I posted in the feed here. I guess this is just with our group. Thanks for comments, everybody. Yeah, I really appreciate your questions. Really great questions. I wish I could see all of you, and you know, be there in person. But yeah, I appreciate the questions and the positive feedback and the constructive criticism that's out there. I appreciate all of it. So whatever you have, send our way. I don't know how much more time we have, but developing a mathematics curriculum that incorporates strategic learning. I mean, I don't know if I could answer that here, but you really have to figure out what your major goals were and what the purpose of it was going to be, and then from there we could maybe figure out a little bit more. What are the needs of the students? What grade level are they? Things like that. All contextual factors really need to be considered. Now, a lot of the principles I talked about today, I think, do apply across the board in a lot of educational contexts, but there's so many nuances to consider with the specific needs of your population and what you have to work with. But I would bring together a team of folks who could bring in the math content knowledge and math instructional strategies. There's a lot of math specific strategies too that students use that are not generic learning strategies like what I was talking about. So we want to have, a real close you would want to have experts in those areas as well as experts in psychology of learning and things like that, and assessment, because you probably want to evaluate if, how successful the strategic math content was, and students could benefit from those assessments as well. So, I think it would involve putting together a team if you really wanted to do something new and innovative and scale it up or something like that. But again, there are just little things you could do as an instructor just by explicitly discussing strategies when you teach and prompting students to set goals, evaluate their progress, prompting students to think about why what they're learning could be useful for them, trying to bring in real-world examples that show the application of mathematics. I mean, mathematics is amazing. I mean, I could get lost in a proof. But, you know, students are often going to want to see how they're going to use it or how they could apply it in the real world. So those are just some thoughts.
Taylor, I think we are running out of time. I'm just receiving much more comments, positive comments. Everybody's saying wonderful conference. I should let you know about that, and thank you so much once more time. And there is a very interesting comment I should share with you, that people is saying that in Brazil it's much more common that we work self-regulation with self-regulation learning with students from humanities, not from exact science as math, as you're saying. So it's it's a comment that is a culture difference that I would like
I see.
And I think if you have time, I would like you to answer one more question. There is a person asking, he's a doctoral student, and he asks you which variable would you include in a model to test self-regulation, a variable other than self-efficacy. Which suggestion could you give to him?
Well, you know, I really liked, in terms of self-report assessments, you know, self-efficacy is a really important variable. It's very predictive of achievement. You know, if you think you can do something, that's a pretty good predictor of whether or not you do it well. So, I mean, I guess, gosh, it's tough. I mean, it depends on what theory you're using to guide your work, and you know, you'd want to represent other variables from that theory. But thinking about the model of strategic learning, you know, I would be interested to see, are students changing in the types of information processing strategies that they're using? So like the Acee has a scale called information processing, and there's other scales that fall under skill, but that one in particular, I think, gets at, you know, many of the core learning strategies, cognitive learning strategies we're trying to teach students. And then their motivational levels. Self-efficacy is predictive of motivation. What goes hand in hand with that is value. So how important and useful they see learning. If you can help students to generate interest and appreciation in their learning, I think that alone is an outcome worthy of change. So even if you don't change their test scores, but you help them to appreciate the subject more, I think that's a win to some extent. So I'd maybe look at, you know, task value scales, things like that. Of course, you can measure effort and motivation. And that might not tell you exactly why they put in effort, why they were motivated, which, you know, measuring value or self-efficacy might explain a little bit more why someone put in effort, but it is good to know how much effort they put in. And so, you know, like the Acee, it has a motivation scale, which I think gets at that. Now, it depends on whether you want to know for the course, like this is a huge thing with assessment. Do you want to assess their perceptions about that course, or do you want to assess their perceptions about education in general? And you know, you'd want to make sure your items are written at a level that addresses what you want. And then, yeah, I love to include a little assessment, like a behavioral type thing, to see if students' behaviors have changed. So in some of my research, I've put up optional readings. So I'd say, hey, you don't have to read this, but if you'd like to, check it out. It's really interesting. It's good stuff. And you could track whether or not students clicked on that. And that would be an indication that they're more motivated or more interested. And of course, you'd want to measure learning. So whatever, if you have a test, or if there's a standardized test, for example, in physics, they have what's called the force concept inventory. It's a standardized test of core physics concepts. And so that actually has norms, like national norms and things like this. So you can really get an idea of how well students learn in those areas. But classroom assessments can work just fine too for that type of purpose. So you asked me to choose one other variable. I don't know, I gave you like 4, I think, but I guess learning, that would be maybe the one other variable. But I think maybe you're assuming that learning would be assessed. So, maybe, I don't know, something related to motivation or use of learning strategies.
So, Taylor, I would like to thank you so much. I also would like to apologize for not having time to answer all of the questions. So I tried to put them together as much as I could. I also would like to let the audience know that we are gonna have Taylor again in the closing session. And we also are going to have a lot of sections that might be helpful to answer the unanswered questions of this session. I apologize, but I think I have to stop here because everybody needs to have lunch. It's lunchtime in Brazil, and we have to come back at 2 o'clock again. I hope everybody understands, and I also would like to thank you very much for such a wonderful conference, for for sharing with us so much knowledge, and for having you here. It's very, very nice for us to have you here. So feel very welcome. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. You are very sweet as well.
Thank you so much, everybody. Have a good rest of your conference. While you have lunch, I'll finish my breakfast.
So have a nice breakfast, Taylor. It's very early for you, yeah. Thank you so much, Taylor. Wonderful. I love it. I took so many notes you can't imagine. I learned a lot. Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye.